thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for your patience, and welcome. We're very lucky to have Asbjørn Wahl here tonight, and given the short notice, it's great to see such a large number of people, and especially a number of people from the academic community and the activist community, graduate students. It's a perfect kind of audience for a night like tonight, and topic that we have here tonight, which is entitled "The Rise and Fall of the Welfare State," which happens to be the title of Asbjørn's latest book. We have copies of which for sale here tonight for $25 if you're interested. But in terms of just an introduction of Asbjørn, as you know from the proposal or invite that went out over the email, he's an advisor to the Norwegian Union of Municipal and General Employees and director of the Campaign for the Welfare State in Norway, which I think you'll have a few things to say about tonight. In addition to that, he's the vice president of the Road Transport Workers section of the International Transport Workers Federation. Say that 12 times late at night. And in addition, he's chair of the ITF Working Group on Climate Change. He's also a member of the Coordinating Committee of the European Social Forum. And of course, he's published a number of articles and articles on politics, social issues, social policy, and labor, both looking at the Norwegian case and international. And as I mentioned, we have copies of his most recent book, The Rise and Fall of the Welfare State, published by Pluto Press. We'll have time for Q&A. Asbjørn's talk will run approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll have time to open up the floor, if that's okay with all of you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for organizing this for me.
Well, I nearly unorganized it, but that's okay.
It's seldom to come to academic building and things works. Sorry. It will change you in it does. Okay. What I'm going to do is more or less to have a speech this evening about the contents of this book, Rise and Fall of the Welfare State. It is a not so very optimistic title. The rise is okay, but the fall. It's a problem. Particularly for somebody like me, who is director for an organization called the Campaign for the Welfare State. But I must admit that increasingly in Norway and in Europe, I do not talk so much anymore about to save the welfare state, because more or less the era of the welfare state seemed to go towards an end. So what I'm talking about is to defend the achievement which we've gone through the welfare state, but maybe in another context, little by little. I think it is important to state from the very beginning that the welfare state represented great progress in terms of living and working conditions, unprecedented in the history of mankind, I say. Public health, life expectancy and social security improved enormously as the welfare state developed in the last century. And the leading part of the world in this development are the Nordic countries in the north of Europe. Because even if we talk about the European social model, there are many different social models also within the welfare state. There is not one welfare state. One used to characterize them as at least three different types. The Nordic one, we have the continental one, which is more or less the German version is used as example. And we have a liberal one where US, Britain, New Zealand, but also within these categories there are differences. There are big differences between the Danish and Swedish and Norwegian welfare state as well. And that is important, I think, to take notice of, because that is because of the different way the welfare state has developed within each country. It also reminds us that the welfare state is not a social model which can be set into a country. It is the result of concrete struggles in each country and the balance of power within the country. But anyway, it was a success, a great success, therefore it has also enormous support in the population, the welfare services and the welfare state. And therefore we also see that people mobilized when the welfare state is attacked. I think in Norway, in the Nordic countries, we hardly characterize the US social model as a welfare state at all, even if it comes into this liberal welfare state, as some say. Okay. One of the main sort of lines which go through my book is that welfare and welfare state and social model is a question of social power. That is, I'm coming back to that again and again. Not least because the understanding in the Nordic countries and in Europe and in the labour movement itself has, to a large degree, left that outside. And they have a different view of the welfare state. So my analysis of the welfare state and my focusing on power in this book was also in order to take part in the internal discussion in the labour movement in the Nordic countries. Because the notion welfare state in the social democratic parties in the Nordic countries, for example, there's a dominant position saying almost the following. We fought hard and long in the trade union and labour movement, end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. But in the 1930s, and particularly after the Second World War, we entered into a sort of class compromise then with employers, capitalist forces. And social peace developed. And we developed this tripartite cooperation and social dialogue. And then we started to develop the welfare state. So we developed the welfare state as a sort of higher level of civilization, in which also the employers realized that that was better for society, for the economy. And that is a dominant understanding, and I challenge that very strongly in this book then, because I think they mix up causes and effects in this way. Because my view is that both the tripartite cooperation and the social peace and the welfare state, they were both effects of the long period, a very, very harsh class struggle which took place in the period before. So it was a struggle which shifted the balance of power and made the welfare state possible. So the welfare state is a question of social power. In the last resort, I say welfare is a question of the distribution of wealth in society. Or to say it in another way, to distribute wealth in society in another way that the market will do. That's the whole point, anyway. Through political intervention in the market, the wealth is distributed in another way than the market does. And the distribution of wealth in society is a question of economic and social power. And then, of course, we can also ask the question, what is it that gives us economic and social power? And in the labour movement and trade union movement, we know very well that we need to have strong organisation. We need to be able to use these organisations. We have to confront the other side, and so on. But in the long term, it is also decisive to get ownership of the important resources and capital in society. As a sort of if we want to stabilize the shift in power balance. there were certain preconditions historically that made the welfare state possible. To me, the welfare state is a result of a very specific historic development in the previous century, and cannot be explained generally, but has to be explained from the very specific situation. And the welfare state is based on 3 pillars. The first one is what I call the social help state, the social state or the social help state, the beginning of public welfare, which already started in Germany in the Bismarck. The first publicly organized welfare services started there, under a reactionary Bismarck. So it was not a progressive force which started to implement the welfare services in Germany. It was a reactionary politician. And why did a reactionary movement or politician started to implement social welfare in Germany? And the historians say there are at least 2 reasons for that. One reason is that the working conditions in the new industry, in the new mines and so on, was so harsh that people were expelled from the labor market over health problems pretty early, and the elite in society actually started to be concerned whether they had enough labor in the future. So one reason was to make possible the reproduction of labor. The second reason for this was maybe more interesting in this connection, because what happened in the period in the Bismarck was that this new working class started to organize and started to radicalize and started to think socialist thoughts, so on. So Bismarck and the capital owners, employees in Germany started to be concerned about this increasing, growing, radical movement. So they introduced social welfare in order to damp the radicalism in the working class. And that is very well illustrated, because what Bismarck did was not only to introduce social welfare, but he at the same time banned the Social Democratic Party. So it was 2 steps which both should contribute to reduce the power of organized labor. So the welfare state is never it is a mix of interest all the time. I will come back to that. The second pillar, of course, which took the welfare state from the very minimum level under Bismarck and other countries up to the level we experienced in Nordic countries in Western Europe in the post-war period, was the struggle of organized labor. That was what the shift in balance between labor and capital that took place. But most of this took place before the welfare state was established and made it possible. The third pillar is linked to this second one, of course, but I think it's worth taking in because it played an important role, the system competition between East and West, between Soviet and the Western capitalist world. And I think it's particularly Erik Hobsbawm, the British historian, who came with that theory in the 1990s in his book on the Age of Extremes. Excellent book on the 20th century. What he said there is, why did the capital owners or the employers in Western Europe accept that such a great part of the value added was used to build welfare for ordinary people? And his answer was, the reason was that the threat from the East, and also how they wanted to get the workers in Western Europe to support the system in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So once again we see the same sort of mechanism as with under Bismarck, that social welfare is introduced not in order to make life better for people, but in order to dampen the radicalism. So this is, we can say, the global or the international power relation which contributed and was necessary in order to develop the welfare state. And then, particularly after the Second World War, the welfare economy developed enormously, based, as I said, on this considerable shift in the balance of power. It was expressed also in these Bretton Woods agreements, which was made towards the end of the Second World War, because that was also based on that kind of compromise. That's the reason why they introduced capital control. They agreed on that on this Bretton Woods conference, and agreed on market interventions. A conference where Keynes took part in and contributed. He didn't achieve everything what he wanted, but important parts of Keynes' policies were adopted or accepted. Of course, there were forces which immediately after Bretton Woods started to try to undermine these things. The US done that more or less in the post-war period, but the dominant politics, at least in Europe in the post-war period, followed the agreement which we reached in Bretton Woods. In this way, market competition was dampened, and that has an effect that the working conditions are better in the market economy. But I think also it's necessary to say that what the social welfare development did was to, at least partly, also to compensate many of the deficiencies of the market economy. It didn't take away the sources for the problem, but it dampened the effects. And social insurance, public services, utilities, and universalism were the effects, the result of this development in Western Europe. But as I said, again and again I come back to that this is linked to this power relation. It is a result of social struggle. The well-developed welfare states, also in the Nordic countries, were a result of social struggles based on popular mobilization and confrontation with the counter-forces. And then again we have to address this, the current self-understanding of the social democratic parties in the Nordic countries. Because they say we achieved this because we started to cooperate, and the tripartite cooperation is so and so. But it isn't so that the Nordic countries has been much more peaceful than other countries in the period where the shift of power in society took place. From the 1880s up to the 1930s, up to the Second World War, there were confrontation after confrontation. There were general strike after general strike. There were lockouts, there were use of military forces and police against striking workers in all the Nordic countries. And also in all the Nordic countries, some workers were killed during some of these confrontations. So there is no doubt what took place in this period. And it was the shift in the balance of power because of this confrontation and the increasing strength of organized labor which made this possible. But after that, and increasingly, I think also it is important to have in mind that what happened when they started to build this welfare economy was that a great part of the economy was taken out of the market and made subject to democratic economies. And that was in the Nordic countries about half of the economy. And that means the political economy of a welfare state, a successful welfare state, consists of 50% democratically planned economy, and the other 50% is a strictly regulated market economy. That was more or less the welfare state in the 1950s and 60s. Then we have to look a bit closer at the class compromise, because it is impossible to understand the welfare state in Western Europe without understanding the class compromise, because the class compromise is more or less the foundation upon which the welfare state was built. And it was a compromise between labour and capital, and it was the result of shifting power relations. Nobody go into a compromise if you can defeat your enemy. So the reality that you at all join into a compromise sort of proves that your opponent is strong. You cannot defeat him. So that was also the reason why the capitalist forces joined into this compromise. They were not able to defeat the working class, organized labor in Europe. And remember what the situation was in 1945 when the Second World War came to an end. It was an attempt at revolution in Greece, which was defeated by French and British military forces. It was on the verge of social upheaval, both in Italy and in France. A very, very strong and radical trade union and labor organization. The communist parties in Italy and France were really strong, and so on. So that was the reason for this compromise. And after the Second World War, then we also achieved a very, very long period of booming capitalism. A very peaceful period, with great progress for ordinary people, and that created also the enormous support for the welfare state. But on the other hand, I think, that is my view, which I argue in this book, that the other side of this development was that it's depoliticized and de-radicalized the labor movement. And I think the reason for that was that they more or less thought the dominant understanding, at least in the Nordic countries, was that the victory was won. We have now got democratic control of the economy. What is remaining now is that we, through gradual development and reforms, reform us into the beloved land, which still was socialism in the programs of these parties. But it should not happen through a very peaceful period with small steps and reforms. And many of these reforms started in the 1950s and 60s, many economic reforms to democratize the economy took place. And the people thought in the labor movement that the crisis-free capitalism was actually a reality. They have created it. Never more mass unemployment as in the 1930s. Now we have political control of the economy. We can use these Keynesian methods, stabilize the economy, and develop further. As we know today, this was an illusion all the way, but that was not so easy to say at that time. And the role of the social democratic parties in this period, because this was really the success story of social democratic parties, because they were the sort of creators. They taught themselves on this welfare state and so on. But what became the real role of social democratic parties in this period, according to my analysis and understanding, is that they became the parties of the class compromise. that they became the parties which administered the society on the basis of the class compromise. What does that mean? That means that they gradually stopped being a mass organization for workers' interests and became a party and organization which administered society on the basis of class compromise. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why the social democratic parties came into so deep ideological and political crisis when the economic crisis started to develop again in the 1980s, 90s and today. Because they were not prepared for that situation. They have left that position. And the parties themselves have changed character during this period. I have another model which can explain also in which way this welfare state came to be in our countries. If we look at this as the private capital in society, what the government did and what happened as a result of this shift in power relations in society was that a lot of legislation was introduced in order to limit the power of capital in society. By one used trade protectionism to strengthen national capital, that is one thing. Capital controls, yeah, I think that was the most important regulation in the post-war period. It hasn't been discussed as last in the last 20-30 years, but I think that is the most important thing, because if you can stop capital owners from export and import capital, you reduce very much the method that they can use in order to put pressure on governments and so on. Because what governments and what multinational companies say today, if you don't reduce our taxation on us, we have to leave for another country. We have to invest in another country, more friendly country. If you have capital control, they could do that. Fixed exchange rate, maybe it's not so important either, but it is look at the enormous economy of speculation for the last 28 years. You understand that played an important role. Regulation of investments and of banks and financial institutions, labor legislation and collective agreements, and that increasing part of the economy was taken out of the market and made subject to political decisions. So this, I think, this all contributed to limit the power of capital, and that means, on the other hand, that to increase the democratic power of people. Yeah. So, in my understanding, in my analysis, this was a precondition for the welfare states in Western Europe. Without this, I don't think we will have been able to develop the welfare state. And I think also that the reason why the US was not able to build the welfare state of a European type was that the labor forces and popular forces, social forces in the US were not strong enough to push through a policy like this. So to me, in other words, the welfare state is not only a sum of social institution and public budget, it is first and foremost the result of certain power relations in society. And another very interesting thing, I think, is that the welfare state was never planned. It was a compromise of interest in a very specific historic situation. The word welfare state, the notion of welfare state, did not exist before the welfare state existed. It was created through the development of the welfare state itself. The first time the word welfare state was used was, I think, some researchers are discussing this, but I think most have agreed now that it was a British priest in 1942 who used the word welfare state, but at that time as the opposite of the Hitler Nazi state.
Welfare state. Absolute warfare state.
Yeah. So, and that is interesting also because the welfare state was not realized because people fought for the welfare state. The welfare state was realized because they fought for socialism. Because that was in the programs, all these political parties and the trade unions and so on. But they didn't succeed, and then the compromise came about, and the compromise became the welfare state. So that is interesting to note today, I think, when we have the discussion in Europe, in the labor movement, in the trade union movement and so on, and there's a lot of discussion on that. My view and my analysis is not mainstream, I have to admit that. Most people think that we should now fight for or defend the welfare state. And I try to say to them that you would never have achieved the welfare state if welfare state was what you fought for. Because the welfare state was a compromise of what you fought for. You represented a threat to capital. And only by representing a threat to capital, by fighting for socialism, were they willing to compromise for the welfare state. You don't start your fight with a compromise. That is, yeah, but that's happening all the time in Europe now. The European Trade Union Confederation have just adopted a statement where they go for the new class compromise. My God, I was in discussion with the General Secretary of the ETUC, as it is called, a month ago, and criticized her for that and tried to explain a little what happened when the welfare state was established. But there is very, very difficult discussion, I tell you. I still think that we can talk together, we can use social dialogue, we can discuss this and agree on it, because as if they can convince the other part that the welfare state is the right thing, while it is a result of power relations. So that is a very, very short history of the welfare state, the rise of it. So now we come to the fall, or to the turning point at least. And that of course is this turning point was the 1970s, the crisis in the world economy. So capitalism was not crisis-free after all. The social pact started to break down. It has broken down now in most of Europe. We still have some reminiscence. We are most in Europe, most in Norway. Norway is an exemption in the international economy today, in many ways. We have hardly any crisis, any effects of the financial crisis. We have hardly any unemployment. The real wages have increased every year in the last 20 years and so on. And my view is that that is mostly an effect of this enormous oil revenue that we have. But it makes us different. But for Norwegian politicians and for Norwegian social democrats, they think that because they are much more clever than the rest of them. It's true. They say so in the public debates. Neoliberalism triumphed, capital control was abolished, markets were deregulated, and again we saw an immense shift in the balance of power, but now in the other direction, from labor to capital. And what happened to this is interesting, I think, and that's my theory then is that this was a precondition for the welfare state. So if we see what happened in the 80s, fixed exchange rates disappeared in the 70s when the US withdrew from the international system. Capital control disappeared in the 1980s all over the Western world. Regulation of investment and regulation of banks and finance and so on disappeared more or less in the 80s and 90s. Trade protectionism, big down through the World Trade Organization negotiations. And the huge public sector has been a reduced public sector, and labor legislation and collective agreements and labor organizations as such are under attack and after attack. So this is the situation today. So if my theory or my statement that the previous figure was the precondition for the welfare state, we are not in a very positive situation for the time being. And that is what made me say that to add the fall of the welfare state, because if this continues on time and force, and coming also now the financial and economic crisis even deeper, this will wipe the welfare state out of the society. Which do not mean that we go back to a society of the 1880s. There will still be high quality health services in society. It is in the US and possibly some of the best health services in the world. Same for education, same for a number of other areas. So that the welfare state disappears doesn't mean that these services disappears. It means they are capitalized and marketized, and that the access to them becomes something completely different. An increasing part of the population will not have access at all, while others have well access to them. So it is the inequality which is increasing when the welfare state breaks down. The effects of this neoliberal offensive that we have seen is that increased pressure from competition at the workplace, in school, in society, in all parts of society. This increased pressure comes in some way or the other. And we see a redistribution of wealth again. And a redistribution of wealth on all the three important areas where redistribution took place in the welfare state. What's happened in the welfare state was that, over the post-war period, was that we redistributed from private to public, from capital to labor, from the rich to the poor. And what has happened over the last 20 years in Western Europe, also including in Norway, which still is in a better situation than most others, is that all the three have turned the other way around. It is now strongly being redistributed wealth from public to private through privatization, competitive tendering and so on, from labor to capital, since capital have taken an increasing part of the value added, and from the poor to the rich, which has created in a way this 1% campaign in the US. And this, of course, undermined the public welfare institutions, and it de-democratized our society and increased the power of capital again. I'll come back a bit more to that at the end, because what is going on in Europe now is so dangerous, you know, and many people do not realize that, not in Europe itself, but not in the rest of the world either. And I'm surprised from time to time to meet people that still use the Nordic countries, and Sweden has been the first one, as if nothing has happened over the last 20 years. It has. More than 30% of the unemployed people in Sweden today do not get any unemployment benefit. And people don't know about that. It has been destroyed, the system, by the current government, conservative government in Sweden. And they are developing in the same direction in Denmark now. And then we have all these myths about the public sector that has come too big, became this slogan that we heard again and again and again in the 1980s. And the interesting thing is it has become too big in all countries, no matter the size of the public sector. It doesn't matter how big the public sector is. It is too big. It is too big in the US. So it has actually become most too big, where it from the outside was smallest like in the US. So it's so easy to see that this is ideology, this is just to create a hegemony in understanding society, which can be used to undermine the welfare state. But of course, it is nonsense. There is no too big public sector. As I say, the power relations in society and the political ideological hegemony decide how much they decide to organize in common and how much is organized outside in the market economy. If socialism at one stage in history should be possible, of course there is no too big public sector. This is what happened to wages internationally. This is created by some German economists, so that's the reason why Germany has come in with its group. And it's European Union 15, the USA and Japan. But
is that wages or wage share? Or
wage share.
Wage share of the GDP?
Wage share of total value added. So if wage share goes down, profits go up. The share to capital goes up. Wage share. And it's not so little either, it's quite considerable reduction. Of course, and this has contributed a lot to creating the enormous amount of financial capital desperately hunting for profit, and contributed by that also to the financial crisis. This is a very important part of the financial crisis, that this happens. So today then, after the 2007-2008 financial crisis, all that, capitalism is in a deeper systemic crisis than at any time since at least the 1930s. But it started in the 1970s. In all countries, whether it was so-called right-wing or left-wing or center government, the politicians responded to this crisis of capitalism in more or less the same way. By deregulating the markets, abolishing capital control and so on. So the neoliberal strategy of global restructuring became the dominant strategy in this period. And particularly in Europe, the European Union has played an immensely important role in this development, because it is the European Union in Europe which has more or less institutionalized neoliberalism. In Europe today, Keynesianism is banned by law. It's true. With all these new treaties and pacts which have been adopted over the last 2 years, they have come in with 2 or 3 different pacts and a huge pile of new legislation in the European Union over the last 2 years as a response to what came after the financial crisis, namely the public debt crisis. And they are using this opportunity now, they uses the crisis in order to ban any other policy in Europe than some sort of neoliberal policies, and a redistribution from bottom to the top. And that tells me also, it shows us in practice, that there is no more room for compromises with labour. And that makes it also ridiculous for the trade union organization in Europe to go for a new class compromise in a situation where they do not have any power to put behind such a demand. So in one way we can say it is humiliating. Trade union movement in Europe humiliate themselves by begging for a compromise. It's true. This is the European level. There are unions in Europe which had realized this, which started to fight back. And I think that will grow when we latest yesterday. Was it yesterday, 15th day, 14th yesterday? Yeah. Yesterday we had a historic event in Europe. first time in the history that we had a transnational general strike and actions and campaigns all over Europe. In 6 countries there were general strikes. In Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, Cyprus and Malta. And in a lot of other countries there were rallies, demonstrations, actions and campaigns of different sorts. So that was an important first, it doesn't change anything because it's too weak flat, but it has to be learned again in Europe to do this. And it has to be learned to do it increasingly across borders. And what happened yesterday was enormously important in that regard, because we're starting to learn to fight back cross-border basis. So, and that is linked exactly to this change of situation in Europe, where we went from a financial crisis to a debt crisis. Exactly because of these gigantic rescue packages which the government used to save the financial system from the crisis. So in most of these countries, the main reason for this debt crisis, the public debt crisis, was the money which was used to rescue the banks. So, but now the dominant media and the right wing and the neoliberals in Europe and many others as well try to say it is because of these lazy Greeks that they haven't used, they have lived beyond the means and so on. Yeah, that is the way they try to get that into the head of people. I think that in 2008, when this financial crisis came to Europe, there was some hesitation among the elite in society and among the capitalist forces, because I think they were afraid of social unrest in that situation. And they started to talk about the necessity to regulate financial capital. But it took very, very short time till they stopped doing that. And they didn't introduce anything. And what was the reason for that? The lack of resistance. They see that there was no resistance, so why should they? So they stopped doing that and changed and started the opposite, namely to use the crisis to get rid of all kind of, to privatize what is left to privatize, to push the governments further into neoliberal policies. On what we see today then is Draconian austerity policies. Wages in the public sector have been cut without negotiation in at least 10 European Union countries. That is serious. Well, what does it mean? It means that the trade unions at the national level in these 10 countries have not been able to defend their own collective agreements. The collective agreements have been set aside by governments and parliaments. And trade unions have not been able to stop it. They are downsizing the public sector, particularly the Troika, as it is called in Europe now, the Troika in Europe, that is the European Central Bank, it is the European Commission, and they have called in help from the experts of the International Monetary Fund, because they are very good at privatizing. They have been doing that for 30 years in the developing countries and Eastern Europe. And now they are called in to help the European Central Bank. None of them have any democratic legitimacy. None of them are elected. And the European Parliament have been completely sidelined. The only democratically elected body in Europe have been completely sidelined in the development of the policies in the European Union over the last 3 years, with all these new pacts and so on. And that's why I say that it's a dangerous situation which is developing now, because Europe is now rapidly moving towards a more authoritarian regime, where they serve financial capital, where they attack welfare and labor organizations. Massive attacks on pensions and social security, and it is enormous dimension of this. One thing is what's going on in Western Europe, and Greece is being brought back now to the developing country. But what has happened is also in many of these Eastern European, those who came last into the European Union. I've been a couple of times in Lithuania. I mean, we cooperated with some left groups and trade unions in Lithuania. And from Lithuania, it's between 30 and 40% of the population have left the country. And they work in other countries in Europe, in Western Europe. And they are exploited, of course, by employers, and social dumping, and all kinds of things. And it's forced privatization, as I said. There's the most extreme example of that is that in Italy, the population actually had an enormous victory a couple of years ago, because they achieved, they have the right to, if they gather not enough signatures, they can ask for a referendum. And they gathered enough to get that on the question of should water be in the public ownership. Huge majority, over 70%, voted that water should be public, should not be privatized. And when this troika came in Italy, and the boss of the European Central Bank then told the Italian government that they should privatize water. And then the answer was, yeah, we just had a referendum forbidding to do that. Doesn't matter. So what is going on in Europe is a massacre of the welfare state in the most crisis-ridden countries. So if you go back to this global power structure, we know when one of them disappeared, and the way that developed, maybe not so many people cried over that either. But that means that the future of the welfare state, the future of the social model, or the social benefits which we achieve through the welfare state, is completely dependent on the struggle of all the state. Of course, that is also. And in addition to that, now there has come not only this one of the pillars that disappeared, and this is a bit declined, but we also got enormous, heavy pressure from above, from the financial and economic crisis. And that is what one of the reasons why I'm afraid of this development. So what went wrong with the welfare state? The welfare state had enormous support in the population. Almost everybody supported the welfare state. In spite of that, they are able to destroy much of it in a short time. And I think there are some reasons for that. And one thing is that the social pact, the class compromise on which the welfare state was built, was and could never be a stable situation. Sort of this compromise, which is based on the real power relations between different social forces, cannot be stable over time. And it was a compromise in a very concrete historical situation. Not a general development. It was a very, very specific historic situation that made the welfare state today. Beginning with the Russian Revolution or the organized labor struggle in Western Europe. And from the beginning, and I'm not fully sure of that it is like that, but I know that in big parts at least of the trade union and labor movement in the 1930s in Norway, the compromise was established in Norway in 1935, concretely. A huge agreement between labor and capital. And at that time, it was no doubt that many of the labor representatives, they considered it a tactical compromise in order to win time and then go further in social progress. But what happened over time in the post-war period, that this tactical compromise became the final aim. So the welfare state was not a step towards the social society. It became an aim in itself. And that changed the entire ideological understanding of the situation and the analysis. But at the same time, the basic power relation, particularly of course the private ownership of means of production, remained intact in this period. So it was, the power of capital was limited, but there was no attempt to change the question of ownership. So at least today we can say, I say that, most people in Norway don't agree with me, but increasing number I think, that the ideology of the social pact had proved wrong. And the Labour, trade union movement and social democrats in particular were taken by surprise by the neoliberal offensive when it's really started in the 1980s. So my statement there that this was just not enough. This was the limitation of capital's power in order to build a welfare state, but it was not enough. And I think the main problem is here, that they didn't start to democratize the ownership of capital and means of production. And I think that is necessary if we are going to create a stable social development for ordinary people. And today the labour movement is in crisis, a deep political ideological crisis on the left, not only the Social Democratic Party, but also parties to the left of the Social Democratic parties. We have had some examples now in Europe over the last 10-15 years, where people to the left of Social Democrats have joined into governments together with Social Democrats. It happened in France in the 1990s, in Italy about 10 years ago, and it is the current situation both in Norway and in Denmark. And all of them tend to end as a disaster. And the biggest losers are the most left-oriented of these parties, because they take power in a situation in which the entire power context and the legal framework push them into pursuing neoliberal policies. And the system criticism is more or less non-existent in these parties. No attempt at mobilizing for power struggle. Almost no measures are put in place in order to weaken the power of financial capital in society. Not even in Norway, and where they used this public money to save the banks, they did not take control of the same banks. They just gave it to the owners. And the crisis is therefore not reinterpreted as public irresponsibility. It's nothing to do with financial crisis. It's changed pretty fast in the media. These are some of the pacts and new legislation that has come into being in the European Union, which I also been through. So many people now, also economists from the US, also Stiglitz and Krugman and others, criticize European Union for pursuing a wrong economic policy. And also the Labour parties and the many trade unions in Europe criticized the European Union for pursuing a wrong policy, because the policy, the austerity policy which they are not pursuing, will not create economic growth, will not create jobs, they say. No, of course not. But the aim of the austerity policy is not to regain economic growth and create jobs. So it is implemented, this policy is implemented in order exactly to destroy the welfare state and defeat trade unions. I haven't met a single mainstream economist, not even on the right, who say that the austerity policy will create economic growth and jobs. And they understand very well what it is, the European elite. It is not growth and jobs, which is the most immediate demands from them. They want first to destroy the welfare state and defeat the trade unions. So the elite uses the crisis as an opportunity to carry out what they did not achieve with the Lisbon strategy, which was the aim to become the most competitive economy in the world by 2010. They didn't achieve that at all, because that means to reduce wages in Europe to the US level, at least. But they do it now with shock therapy in the aftermath of the crisis. Now they achieve what they really wanted with the Lisbon strategy. So we have enormously important challenges ahead in Europe. The class compromises breaking has broken down. Social partnership ideology is doomed to fall. And we have these negative experiences with social democratic and center-left government. When the crisis policy, austerity policy started in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, it was run by social democratic government in all of them. They have disappeared all now, not least because of that. And these are the 4 countries where also parties to the left have been in and been destroyed. And what makes the situation dangerous, in my view, is not least this that the European Union now moves in an authoritarian direction without being noticed by the broad left. Because most people do not realize that that is happening. So my conclusion is that if we want emancipatory social policies, we have to shift the balance of power. And the welfare state did not go far enough in taking democratic control of the economy. So a new needs-based social model will have to go beyond the Keynesian welfare state. Is there light at the end of the tunnel?
Oh, they're better.
Or is there a train in the opposite direction?
2 trains.
Well, I think in any way the era of the welfare state comes to an end, because the welfare state is a very specific historic construction. So the question is not whether we can keep the welfare state or not. The question is, how do we achieve social progress again in society? So it's not to save the welfare state, but to defend the achievements, which is very important. So our future will depend on the development of the social struggle now, the balance of power in society, and a higher level of civilization. That is my last conclusion. It is still possible, but only through mobilization of broad social forces. We have to go back to basic again and mobilize from below, build enough social power to shift power relations and start to build something better than the welfare state. So that is my message.